Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte and welcome back to Situ, Operation Wallacea's online lecture series. This week we have our very own Sophia Wood, who you may recognise from the question and answer sessions. She's going to be talking to us about keeping Indigenous communities at the centre of conservation and also telling you more about our sister organisation, Friends of Wallacea. So I'll hand over to Sophia, enjoy and come back and watch the rest of our series.
Hi everybody, my name is Sophia Wood and today I will be talking to you a little bit about the importance of putting Indigenous communities at the center of our global conservation efforts. If you've been watching along our Situ lecture series, you've potentially seen me doing some of the Q&A sessions, but today the tables have turned a bit and I will be presenting on some of the work that I'm doing and Opwall is doing to engage local communities in our conservation efforts to ensure that they're sustainable in the long term and that they benefit the communities that are most affected by living on the front lines of our global conservation areas. So today at Opwall, I have two roles. I work as the country manager for our Ecuador and Galapagos programs, which I will talk a bit about in this presentation. And I'm also the CEO of an initiative that Opwall started last year called Friends of Wallacea that partners with Indigenous and rural communities worldwide to develop community-led wildlife tourism that empowers locals to take on long-term ecosystem stewardship. And through this, we hope to prevent biodiversity loss and enable and empower local communities to make a profit from conservation efforts in the areas where Opwall works and hopefully in other areas around the world. So just before I get started, a little bit of my background. I was actually trained as a political scientist, and I'm actually one of the many people from this lecture series whose career in conservation was launched by Opwall. But when I originally started studying my undergraduate degree, I was particularly passionate about and interested in the power of tourism as a sustainable development tool in emerging economies. And over the time that I was studying, I studied for a year in Chile, which is actually where I live most of the time right now, except for now when I'm home because of the current crisis in Seattle. But I spent a year in Chile and started to become very interested in the potential for community-based tourism at a smaller level to empower especially Indigenous communities to take on economic development projects and conservation projects that were aligned with their cultural beliefs and would allow them to become economically independent from the states where they live. So I actually pursued my dissertation studying specifically that and spent the last year of my time at university studying and interviewing communities in two sites. One was in the south of Chile with an indigenous Mapuche community living along the largest saltwater lake in Latin America called Lago Budi in a town or a village called Yaguapuyi that had community-based tourism that was helping support the community and had a lot of successful outcomes, including enabling them to build the first bilingual Mapuzungun Spanish school in the region. And the other area where I was doing my research was in southern Kenya, along the Masai Mara, with a Maasai community that had developed a lodge to support several efforts within their community, including building 3 schools and a girls' rescue center from early child marriage. They were training rangers to work in the Masai Mara and also training rangers who would work within a community-owned conservation area. So the lodge, Older Poimara camp, where I stayed during this research, was actually so successful that the community and the leaders in charge of this camp decided to create a community-based conservation area that leased land from all the local landowners that they would leave fallow, removed fencing, and was able to turn this area into a corridor that connected the Masai Mara to the next community-based conservation area nearby. And by the time I visited in 2017, this conservation area had been open for just around 10-11 months, and they had already seen the whole African Big Five there. They've continued this effort over the last 5 years, and actually I wanted to bring them up because I'm incredibly proud of them, as they just won the Equator Prize, which is a prize given to Indigenous community efforts to link conservation to economic development efforts on the ground. And they've continued to grow their conservation and economic development projects locally. So I'm very excited to continue to watch them growing. So that's kind of how I got involved in starting to do this research. And while I was researching my thesis, I was particularly interested in the economic development effects, but it was actually when I started working with OPWAL that I started thinking about the potential to empower these communities to get involved in conservation, which, as we'll talk about a little bit more, these communities are already the best environmental stewards in the world, and so many times it's a question of providing the income to unlock these communities' ability to protect their wildlife and their territory, rather than actually kind of convincing anybody to do anything different from what they would do. So I started my work with OPWAL in 2017. I actually flew out to Fiji about 10 days after graduating from university. So that's on the left is a picture in Savu Savu, Fiji, with Martin Spate, who will be presenting in a few weeks. And I was brought in to work with the local community in Fiji, whose land was being used for OPWAL's research, and I was working with this community to ensure that they were interested in and accepting of the research that we were doing and potential to develop long-term conservation programs on their land. Fiji's a really special place to do this kind of work because the Indigenous community makes up about 87% of the population, and they own almost all the land across Fiji's 300 plus islands. So they have a lot of land power, but they don't have a lot of political power, and certainly not a lot of economic power. And so it requires a lot of organization to create conservation areas and protect specific areas of forest, which is part of the work that we were doing in this first year that I was able to go to Fiji. I'm very pleased to say that although I haven't returned to the Fiji project, OPWAL is now working with 50 plus communities on the Natewa Peninsula to protect the remaining forest there, which is home to many species of endemic birds and herps. So that's very exciting. Since I worked in Fiji, I've now taken on the OPWAL Ecuador project, where we are working in a crucial area for Amazon rainforest protection in Ecuador. We work with a community, a Quechua indigenous community called Sahni Isla, that uses ecotourism to protect about 40,000 hectares of virgin rainforest while continuing to live within their traditional livelihoods and trying to prevent oil exploitation and expansion of the petroleum industry in Ecuador, which is the major cause of deforestation in the region. So a lot of our work, obviously studying the biodiversity that this area protects, where we've been doing research for about 5 years now, but it's also trying to find ways to continue to help this community make enough income to replace the money that they would make from oil, so that they can continue to resist the growth of the oil industry. So I've mentioned the term Indigenous people several times already in this presentation, so I just wanted to take a second to define it. As I mentioned, I'm a political scientist, so I love talking about treaties, but I will avoid talking about them as much as possible because I'm not sure everybody shares that passion with me. So Indigenous communities have relatively poorly protected rights on a national level, and so it often requires looking towards international laws like treaties to find proper definitions that can be accepted worldwide, because these are communities that are not only within a single country, but they are widely spread around the world, as I'll talk about on the next slide. So basically, in global politics, or international law, the only binding treaty that protects the rights of Indigenous peoples, specifically protecting their right to be consented before there's extraction or development on their land, is the 169th Convention of the International Labour Organization, or ILO. And this convention defines Indigenous peoples as tribal peoples in independent countries whose social, cultural, and economic conditions distinguish them from other sections of the national community. So there is very little consensus worldwide on the definition of Indigenous peoples, and so depending on how this is defined, it can include more or fewer people, but a lot of the international laws and national laws that speak to the rights of Indigenous peoples actually leave up this definition to kind of self-definition and self-determination on the part of people who consider themselves to be Indigenous. So I'll leave it that way as well, because I think that's probably the best way for people to define themselves. But when we talk about Indigenous peoples within the definition that I've mentioned, that's generally going to comprise about 370 million people in 92 countries worldwide. So that makes up about 5% of the global population, so around the size of the population of the United States. But this community has a disproportionate burden of poverty and makes up 15% of the world's extreme poor. So this is people living on under $2 a day. That being said, although it sounds like a really easy definition from the last slide, Indigenous peoples are incredibly hard to define as a group. They make up at least 1,000, if not 2,000 or 3,000 different linguistic and ethnic groups, even within a single country or territory. Just speaking about the areas where we work, for example, in Ecuador, even within the Sahni community, which is an 800-person Quechua-speaking community that spans both sides of a large river called the Napo River, the largest tributary to the Amazon, they speak 2 different Quechua dialects that are distinct enough that they can occasionally have trouble understanding each other. And they live right across the river from each other and are defined as within the same community. So dealing with these communities that are often very small and fragmented can mean it is hard to find a one-size-fits-all solution to involve communities within conservation efforts and economic development efforts nationally and on an international level. The last treaty I'm going to talk about is another really important one for protecting the rights of Indigenous people, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was passed in 2007 and is meant to be in addition to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And some of the most important rights that are protected in it are the right to self-determination, which gives Indigenous communities the right to self-government and the right to their own legal structures within their national territories. It also gives them the right to protect their language, medicine, and traditions in whatever way that means. So that can often mean refusing to assimilate into national cultures or refusing to assimilate into national economic development programs, which can often mean extractive industries, especially in developing economies, for example, Ecuador, where a lot of the national development is petroleum. 1/3 of Ecuador's economy is made up of petroleum exports. So these communities have a right to resist and protect their territory from these kinds of extractive industries. And finally, they also have the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources. That being said, these are often undermined by national governments in Ecuador. They've gotten around this by making it legal, making it so that communities don't have legal rights of the minerals underneath the land, which happens in many, many areas around the world and makes it easy for extraction to happen within community-owned territories. But this is a nationally protected law and or nationally protected right internationally. That being said, UN declarations are non-binding, so although over 150 countries worldwide have ratified this document, they have no legal requirement to follow what's in it. But Indigenous communities are participating more and more in international conferences on climate change and are taking an understanding of their role in actively protecting land that is not only protecting their local culture and way of life, but also is a patrimony of humanity that is preventing global warming by just standing. And communities have an understanding of their role in this effort. And so they continue to resist assimilation and are continuing now to take a larger and more vocal role on a global stage to resist assimilation into the traditional extraction models that would bring them roads and healthcare and education, but also kind of expose them to the potential of what might be called kind of fishbone exploitation, which is basically where a road comes in through the forest and additional roads split off through the forest, and it can very quickly lead to deforestation and the loss of the forest. That would also lead to the loss of obviously significant amounts of stored carbon and also the traditional ways of life of these communities. So why are these communities so important to climate change and reversing biodiversity loss? An article came out in Nature in 2018 called Biodiversity, the Ravages of Guns, Nets, and Bulldozers. I've put the citation at the end of this presentation if you want to look it up. It's available online. And it basically talks about how communities living on the front lines of conservation areas and areas of high biodiversity, their choices directly affect species extinction more than anyone else on Earth. And while many of these communities might be interested in and aware of the importance of protecting local species and endangered species, these are also some of the most vulnerable communities on Earth, and they also feel some of the highest effects of climate change and also of living within these areas of high biodiversity. So an anecdote that I often bring up for students while in Ecuador to kind of put this into perspective was in 2018, during our season, we had a couple of guides who were brothers who had worked with us for many years and who have worked at the Eco Lodge and have been very involved in all the aspects of conservation in the community, and so therefore could be considered really major environmental stewards in their community. And they came up to our herpetologist and were very excited to show him a picture of a bushmaster, which is a very rare type of viper. It's actually one of the biggest vipers in the world. And it was dead. And our entire scientific team was really disappointed and upset to see that they had killed this incredibly rare snake, which none of us had ever seen alive, and that all of us know is obviously very important to the local ecosystem, and we were very quick to criticize and ask them what had happened, and they looked back at us and said, well, our mom stepped on it, and it was about to bite her, and she would have died, so we had to kill it. And this community is about 3 hours from the closest hospital by canoe, motor boat, and would have had no way to get this woman out to medical care if she'd been bitten. Obviously, this moment is one that's stuck in my head as realizing the importance of, or the effect of, human-wildlife conflicts on the communities that live near these areas, and also the importance of their land rights, which are sometimes and often undermined to promote conservation in certain areas. So this anecdote, I think, really highlights why communities need to be involved on an ethical standpoint, but I'll talk a little bit more through the rest of the presentation why it's also practical and more effective towards conservation to involve communities in these efforts. So this article in Nature magazine studied over 8,000 different threatened and near threatened species on the IUCN Red List, and what they found was that the top 7 causes of species extinction worldwide, overexploitation and agricultural activity through logging, planting, fishing, aquaculture, livestock, crop harvesting, and several other activities were far and above the biggest threats to biodiversity loss. And if you look at this, climate change, which obviously is one of the aspects that is kind of one challenge that gets the most press, is actually 7th on the list. And that's not to say that climate change isn't important and that we shouldn't be paying attention to it when we're talking about conservation, because we absolutely should. But when we're talking about specifically biodiversity loss, human activity within areas that are important to conservation is clearly the biggest factor here. And so while many communities aim and desire to protect areas, they also need help to shift away from traditional forms of extractive industry like agriculture, like hunting, and to do that, they require an economic incentive, just like any of us. These communities are particularly vulnerable to shocks because of their economic marginalization. That means that an economic shock, such as the current virus, could make them cut down or sell or lease forests to extractive industries, and unfortunately in these situations there's no going back. And so we've started to look at tourism through the experience, Opwell's experience, and also through some of the research that I've done and other political scientists and anthropologists have done, and finding that bringing visitors to this area with specific models of low impact wildlife-focused tourism can bring in sufficient income to promote the protection of these species and shift people away from overexploitation and agricultural activity that's causing the vast majority of species extinction worldwide. So very quickly, these communities are particularly important because they manage about 24% of the land left on Earth and 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And that biodiversity exists not despite these communities living within these territories, but because of it. They have, as I said earlier, have taken an increasingly vocal and thousand-of-year-old role in preventing the expansion of extractive industries into their territories. If you ever pick up National Geographic magazine, you will constantly see fights between Amazonian indigenous communities and miners, loggers, and oil industry, and that is a major aspect of protecting the remaining biodiversity on Earth today. So these communities have within their hands some of the most vulnerable species remaining on Earth, and therefore must be empowered to protect them. They also live traditionally within the forest, and their cultures, languages, medicines, many other aspects of their traditions are deeply intertwined with living within nature, whether it's forest or savanna or desert. And so these communities and their cultures and protecting these unique cultures is actually intrinsically linked with protecting nature. And when it comes down to land rights, a lot of these communities, their ancestral and modern territories overlap with national protected areas, which creates potential for conflict. If you have a community that has lived for hundreds of years within an area, hunting at a relatively sustainable level, and a national government or international NGO comes in to tell them that they can no longer hunt there because this is a protected area, you've suddenly created an enemy of conservation where we once had environmental stewards. And so it is particularly important to have these communities empowered, interested, and excited about conservation efforts within their territories that will benefit them and not punish them for the work that they've done for many, many years to protect these areas. And basically, on the bright side, many of these communities want to maintain and protect their traditional ways of life. And so it's actually relatively easy to bring them into these efforts. But it requires, obviously, in many cases, economic incentive, because these communities are often disempowered at a national level to be able to participate in these kinds of efforts. So some of the challenges regarding involving communities in conservation efforts are that they've often been disenfranchised from their territories by national governments or private companies. I mentioned efforts of exploitation by basically undermining rights to land by saying, by making land rights soil deep. Another challenge, obviously, is the lack of resources and poverty and a lack of legal power within their home governments. A lot of these communities don't have political representation or legal representation, and therefore often suffer if there is any kind of environmental crisis or effort to exploit their land. For example, actually this picture is from along the Napa River on our way down to the Sahni community, and it is a picture of an oil barge. And just a few months ago, there was an oil spill in the Ecuadorian Amazon of nearly 16,000 barrels of oil, and the communities have not yet received really much kind of justice in that case in terms of protection, and they are now in a legal battle with the oil companies to receive any kind of retribution from the oil spill that has destroyed all their fish stocks and water sources, making their lives really difficult, especially during time of coronavirus. Another major challenge to working with these communities rather than working around them is linguistic and cultural barriers. So a lot of these communities speak very specific languages that are spoken by very few groups of people, and anthropologists that work with these communities might spend years and years learning local indigenous languages in order to be able to work effectively with communities. And as many people working in conservation know, that's not necessarily something that there's time to do when we're working with particularly endangered or vulnerable species. And so it requires overcoming these cultural barriers by bringing in translators and ensuring that everyone is able to understand and be on the same page before any action is taken. And partially because of these cultural and linguistic barriers, communities can often be reticent to actually working with outsiders and working with, foreign workers, because they've often been exploited or found that these organizations are unwilling to listen to their way of doing things, or unwilling to understand how they interact with nature on a daily basis, and therefore do not implement conservation programs that enable these people to continue their ways of life or even thrive within areas of high biodiversity. And finally, one of the major challenges is limited access to education locally, which can often be because these communities live in very remote areas of the world. They might not be recognized by their local governments, and they often suffer as well from brain drain of young people leaving the community to work within cities because they can't find work or significant income within their local communities, and therefore there aren't necessarily also people to implement projects locally because they've all left for the cities. And now in this presentation I've mostly talked about Indigenous communities, and I've used it somewhat interchangeably with local communities. These aren't the same thing, but I will continue to use them interchangeably because we are mostly talking about Indigenous communities, but also local and rural communities who live on the frontiers of conservation, communities who live nearby biodiversity hotspots or areas of natural value. And all of these communities are affected by and also deeply affect conservation and ecosystem management within these areas, and so therefore must be empowered and hopefully involved with a financial benefit in any programs and attempts to protect these areas, because otherwise these efforts will ultimately fail, because you end up turning local people into enemies of conservation rather than supporters. And so a lot of the time, if you're thinking, for example, about agricultural areas, there can be significant human-wildlife conflicts, whether between herbivores eating crops or carnivores eating livestock, that can cause these communities to have a negative perspective of wildlife rather than a positive one where they see it as important to protect. So just coming into Oppol's experience and how we've worked to empower these communities so that they're informed and involved in any kind of conservation efforts that we are doing. Over 25 years and over 13 different countries, Oppol's noticed that communities that receive a sustainable income from any non-extractive activity, such as tourism, are willing to practice more sustainable ecosystem stewardship. And so many of the communities that work with Oppol actually only receive or are working in tourism for only 2 or 3 months of the year while they work with Oppol, but would be able to pursue longer-term, more sustainable and deeper conservation efforts, and also, be more significantly removed from extractive practices if they were able to make this kind of income year-round. Now, obviously, the current crisis has brought up the question for looking for alternative income sources besides tourism, which I think also Niall brought up in his Situ lecture a few weeks ago. And this is something that's still a major question that hasn't been answered yet, of other ways to bring communities into conservation efforts in a way that is economically beneficial for them, but doesn't necessarily require people to travel internationally. So most importantly, when we're talking about bringing these communities into conservation efforts, it's important to see them as agents of change and not as victims. On the one hand, these communities that live within conservation areas, whether they're islander communities, rainforest communities, savanna communities, are often the first to feel the effects of climate change because they live within areas that might have further impacts from natural disasters, and they also have low levels of legal protection and historical context of being marginalized from their national governments and national societies. So these communities, on an ethical standpoint, must be involved and informed about any work that's going to be done near or on their land. And from another perspective, is also significantly more effective for conservation to involve these communities that live within these areas in conservation efforts. These communities manage by far and above the majority of the biodiversity hotspots in the world, and they have a vested interest in protecting this territory and species and understand the importance of doing so. And by involving communities and ensuring that the income related to conservation and tourism goes directly into these communities, we actually create a win-win by empowering local communities and making them more resilient, minimizing the leakage or economic leakage of tourism dollars outside of the country, which creates greater economic development locally, and also helps protect endangered species. So while we're involving communities in these kinds of conservation decisions, it requires long-term relationships, building a lot of trust, and most importantly, ensuring that communities that are involved in any kind of projects on their land are doing so with free and informed consent. This requires having conversations in their own language, in language that they understand, and ensuring that communities are going to benefit clearly and that they understand the benefits and potential, hopefully, financial incentives to participate in these kinds of programs, so that they can be involved long-term without feeling any kind of pressure to change industries because of economic reasons. So obviously we've looked into tourism as a potential answer for this for a long time, and this is the subject of my research. Tourism isn't a perfect solution, but I do believe it's one of the best solutions available today when it is managed effectively. So tourism dollars are one of the most effective ways to bring economic development into a country, especially when it's spent within rural indigenous communities. So tourism dollars, for every dollar that's spent within an emerging economy in tourism, generates about $3.20 within the rest of the economy. And that jumps, more than doubles to, for every dollar spent, jumps to $7 in the rest of the economy when these are spent in protected areas and areas of high biodiversity. And so if we can push and shift tourism spending into rural communities, and especially rural indigenous communities that are living in areas of high biodiversity, we can deliberately redistribute funds into environmental protection significantly more effectively than almost any kind of national or international conservation effort. And actually, dollars spent visiting national parks, protected areas, and community protected areas worldwide were about 60 times higher than the amount of money that was spent on just deliberate conservation efforts in 2015. So people are really excited to visit places and see beautiful wildlife and visit unique communities. And if they can do so in a way that protects these communities, I think it can be even more effective than just straight conservation efforts. So that's why we created Friends of Wallacea last year. Basically, our mission is to help rural and indigenous communities generate demand for tours that showcase and protect their unique wildlife, spread this income within and among communities, and connect communities to the international travel market. So Friends of Wallacea, specifically in most of the communities where we work, develops wildlife service tourism that brings income directly into communities that live on the front lines of conservation to help protect the remaining pockets of biodiversity that these communities manage. So we created these to basically develop an opportunity to travel to remote, beautiful areas of the world, view unique wildlife in its natural habitat, and experience a unique culture while living with and alongside indigenous communities. Now, we're working right now in several of the communities where OPWAL works. Obviously, this project is on pause for the current pandemic, but we are developing programs in Europe which will launch soon, which I'll talk about at the end of this presentation. But we will continue to be developing programs with several of OPWAL's partner communities to leverage the research and wildlife knowledge and infrastructure that OPWAL has placed in these communities to enable them to make income that promotes and incentivizes the protection of their local wildlife. So one of the best examples of this, as I'm rounding out, is the Sahni Isla community, which I've brought up several times here, as they were a huge inspiration for Friends of Wallacea and for all of this work. This is an 800-person community protecting 40,000 hectares of virgin rainforest within the Amazon, the Ecuadorian Amazon. They live on both sides of the Napo River, which, as I said, is the largest tributary to the Amazon. And they actually have ancestral claims within Yasuni National Park, which is one of the most biodiverse areas on Earth. This community has managed to protect this land because of ecotourism. They were able to receive a significant payout from an oil company about 40 years ago and build this lodge, and they have used this lodge to continue to enforce strict local rules around land use, hunting, and fishing. You can't use weapons in the reserve. You cannot use motorboats in the reserve because they protect a significant proportion of Ecuador's remaining critically endangered giant otter population that lives within this lagoon, and they bring in hundreds of tourists every year that help bring in the income that Sahni needs to continue to resist oil development. And they're doing a very good job of successfully spreading this income within the community by rotating the guides through the lodge and also having several different tourism operations within the community that empower both men and women to make an income from tourism and basically incentivize them to continue protecting this area. One of the other areas where we work is in Europe and in Romania specifically. So obviously I've talked a lot about Indigenous communities in this wildlife service model, but we also have another model which is driving tourism income to rural areas that also live in wildlife in areas of high biodiversity. So the area where we work in Transylvania, just outside of the town of Sighișoara, is very popular for cultural tourism. And we are helping shift the income from tourism out of these cities and hotspots into rural areas and helping both farmers and hunters make money off of protecting wildlife rather than fighting it. And so we are looking at building a sustainable business that spreads benefits from tourism more evenly. And this program at Ngofa enables us to do biodiversity monitoring in one of Europe's wildest regions. And on this project, we're working with a local NGO called Adept that owns this beautiful Saxon house in the countryside just outside of Sighișoara that we're turning into a center for biodiversity monitoring in rural Europe. So before you travel, obviously, we would be more than thrilled to have any of you travel with Friends of Wallacea to visit any of these opal sites that are working with us and other areas around the world that are working with us to develop wildlife-focused tourism. But if you're traveling anywhere in the world, do your research before you go. Find out if you can go with local tour operators and ensure that the vast majority of the money that you're spending locally is staying within the country. So if you're staying in a big box hotel, most of the money will just go back to the country where you came from or the country where the hotel is founded. So try to buy as many of your products locally, stay in locally owned accommodations, make sure your money is really going to the communities that are affected by you being there and that are hosting you there. And also, as I said, since the multiplier effect on money spent in national parks and protected areas is so high, try to visit these beautiful nature reserves and areas, pay your entrance fee, hopefully visit community-owned areas that you're able to pay the entrance fee directly to the community that's managing the area, and make your tourism dollars go far, because they have a really deep and lasting effect on communities and conservation when they're spent in the right way. I have a bunch of resources here that if you want to study more about Indigenous rights or Indigenous peoples when it comes to conservation efforts, these are really helpful, that they've been really helpful to me, so I definitely recommend Conservation Refugees if you want to understand how conservation has potentially negatively affected communities in the past and why it's particularly important to involve them. And finally, basically, if you would like to know what's going on with Friends of Wallacea and when we're launching our newest tours, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Wallacea Friends. And we're actually just about to launch an internship program in Europe, both in Romania and Croatia. And Croatia has a marine and a terrestrial site where people can volunteer and work for 2 to 8 weeks to basically get a jump on a career in conservation or in sustainable development by helping develop sustainable businesses in these rural communities and monitor and protect the biodiversity that lives within these wild areas of Europe. So if you're interested in these programs, we have a waitlist open right now on our website at friendsofwallacea.org/waitlist, and I highly recommend getting on the waitlist as soon as possible, as it'll close in just a few days, and we'll be giving discounts to anyone who signs up through the waitlist. And if you have any further questions, you can reach out to me at info@friendsofwallacea.com for more information, and follow us on social media for really any updates about these programs and any future programs. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I will see you in the question and answer session. I promise I will not question and answer myself. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day.